Chosen one, what they whispered in private is about to be public. Over 8 billion people breathe on this planet, yet God says He singled you out before your first breath ever touched the air. That number alone should unsettle your enemies. Out of billions of voices, billions of destinies, billions of stories, He carved your name into eternity. And what they whispered about you in private? It has already reached heaven's courtroom. The verdict is about to echo publicly. God says, "Chosen one," while they were leaning toward each other in dim rooms, lowering their voices and guarding their secrets, I was leaning toward you. I heard every syllable. I recorded every intention. What they thought was hidden strategy was actually staged exposure. You felt it, didn't you? The shift, the distance, the way conversations stopped when you walked in, the way smiles carried undertones. You sensed something was being spoken behind closed doors, but you couldn't prove it. That uncertainty was the test, because if I had shown you everything immediately, you would have reacted in the flesh. Instead, I kept you silent while I gathered evidence. And here is the first thing they whispered in private. Number one, they're not as strong as they look. If we apply pressure, they'll break. God says, they mistook your silence for weakness. They misread your restraint as fear. They thought isolation would thin your skin. But what they didn't know is that pressure was my chosen tool. I was not crushing you, I was compressing you. Diamonds are not formed in applause, they are formed in darkness. They watched you endure loss without public complaint. They watched you walk through betrayal without exploding. They watched you rebuild quietly. And in their secret circles, they convinced themselves you were almost finished. But heaven whispered back, no, they are almost revealed. What they called breaking was actually bending into purpose. What they called loneliness was actually separation for elevation. And while they strategized privately, I fortified you spiritually. Your nights of confusion were not abandonment, they were training grounds. Your unanswered messages, your closed doors, your sudden distancing from people you once trusted, all of it was alignment. God says, I allowed their whispers because I needed their words to fulfill prophecy. Every accusation became fuel. Every lie became leverage. Every secret meeting became a stepping stone. Here is what they didn't calculate. The same private room they used to speak against you will soon be the room where your name is defended. The same lips that questioned your calling will repeat your testimony. I am not just exposing conversations, I am reversing narratives. You've been wondering why certain invitations stopped, why certain opportunities paused, why certain alliances dissolved without explanation. It was because their private counsel was trying to vote you out of a seat I assigned you to occupy. And I do not revoke what I have ordained. God says, chosen one, I will make it public, not to embarrass you, but to establish you. There is a moment approaching when clarity will hit like thunder, when truth will surface in a way you didn't force, when you won't need to defend yourself because the exposure will defend you. I am orchestrating a reveal that does not require your retaliation. Right now, some of you can feel it in your spirit, a subtle tension in the atmosphere. That's because the whisper season is ending. And when whispers turn into announcements, they shake rooms. Stay steady, stay disciplined, stay watchful, because the first private whisper was about your strength, and they got it completely wrong. But what they whispered next, it went deeper. It questioned something even more dangerous. And when that one becomes public, it won't just clear your name, it will shift your position. And what they said in that second private circle is closer to the surface than they think. And what they whispered next was not about you. And what they whispered next was not about your strength. It was about your future. They weren't just trying to measure your endurance anymore. They were trying to calculate your ceiling. God says, chosen one, I let them speak freely because exposure requires confidence. I allowed them to reveal their hearts without interruption. They thought privacy was protection. They didn't know privacy was preparation. Here is the second thing they whispered in private. Number 2. If they rise any higher, we'll lose influence. We need to limit their reach. They saw something on you. Not just talent, not just charisma, not just favor. They saw trajectory. And trajectory threatens those who survive on control. So they began planting subtle seeds. Delays disguised as wisdom. Doubt disguised as concern. Advice wrapped in limitation. You wondered why certain support felt conditional. Why encouragement sometimes came with invisible boundaries. Why doors opened halfway and then hesitated. It wasn't random, it was resistance. God says, they were not afraid of who you were, they were afraid of who you are becoming. Because elevation is not loud at first. It starts quietly, internally, spiritually. I began expanding your thinking, stretching your endurance, increasing your discernment. And as you evolved, they sensed it, even when you said nothing, even when you stayed humble, even when you avoided the spotlight. In their private meetings, they tried to predict your limits. They spoke ceilings over someone I already declared limitless within my will. They attempted to cap what I called open. They whispered, keep them close enough to monitor, but not free enough to soar. They whispered, don't let them connect with the wrong people. They whispered, delay their access. But what they didn't understand is that delay in my hands is design. God says, every blocked path was redirected. Every closed door rerouted you towards something larger. While they tried to restrict your reach, I expanded your territory in ways they couldn't see. You thought some separations were losses. I call them strategic removals. You thought some missed opportunities were setbacks. I call them divine edits. I will not allow your destiny to be negotiated in private by insecure voices. And here is the part that unsettles them now. You didn't collapse under limitation. You adapted. You grew sharper, more independent, more spiritually aligned. The very boundaries they tried to place around you forced you to build deeper roots. They assumed you needed their endorsement. They assumed you required their platform. They assumed your rise depended on their approval. God says, I am your endorsement. I am your platform. I am your approval. And soon the evidence will be undeniable. There is a public moment forming, a shift where your access will expand beyond their control. Connections you never forced will appear naturally. Invitations that bypass gatekeepers will surface. Influence will come without manipulation. Because when I decide to elevate you, I do it in a way no private counsel can sabotage. Listen carefully. They are already sensing the change. That is why tension is increasing. That is why some attitudes feel unsettled around you. They feel the momentum turning. They know something is slipping out of their grip. God says, chosen one, I did not anoint you to remain manageable. The whisper about limiting your reach is about to backfire. The more they tried to contain you, the more I prepared you for overflow. And when overflow comes, it does not ask permission. Stay disciplined. Stay silent when necessary. Stay focused. You are not behind. You are not overlooked. You are not capped. You are calibrated. If this word is confirming what your spirit already sensed, don't just scroll past it. Receive it. Align with it. Let it settle deep. Because the third private whisper was not about your strength, not about your reach. It questioned something sacred. And when that one is exposed publicly, it won't just shift rooms. It will shake foundations. There is a whisper that crossed a sacred line. The first questioned your strength. The second questioned your reach. But the third, it questioned your calling. And that is where heaven stopped observing and started preparing intervention. God says, chosen one, they could doubt your endurance. They could speculate about your influence. But when they questioned what I placed on you, they stepped into territory they do not control. Here is the third thing they whispered in private. Number 3, did God really choose them? Or did they just choose themselves? It sounded subtle, almost intellectual, almost spiritual, but it carried poison. Because if they could convince others that your calling was self-appointed, they could discredit your authority without ever confronting you directly. You felt this one deeper than the others. It wasn't about opportunity, it wasn't about access, it was about legitimacy. Suddenly you noticed side eyes when you spoke boldly. You noticed hesitation when you stepped forward. You noticed how your confidence was labeled pride by those who never carried your burden. God says, they tried to reduce revelation to ambition. They tried to reinterpret obedience as ego. They tried to reframe my selection as self-promotion. But here is the scripture that anchors your truth. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Book of Romans 9:13. Before Jacob performed, before he proved himself, before he negotiated his identity, I had already chosen. My calling is not a public vote. It is a private decision made in eternity. God says, I do not consult insecurity before I anoint. I do not request permission before I appoint. They whispered, who gave them authority? And heaven answered, I did. They whispered, why them? And heaven answered, because I decided. You need to understand something. People become uncomfortable when grace selects someone they cannot control. Your calling exposes their comparison. Your favor highlights their stagnation. And instead of confronting their own limitations, they attempted to question your legitimacy. But the calling on your life does not shrink under scrutiny. It sharpens. God says, if I called you, I will confirm you. Confirmation is coming publicly, not in a boastful way, not in arrogance, but in undeniable fruit. Results that speak without explanation. Doors that open without lobbying. Influence that grows without campaigning. They thought if they could plant enough doubt around you, your confidence would erode internally. They hoped you would second-guess yourself, and for a moment, you did. You questioned your timing. You questioned your readiness. You questioned whether you misheard me. But doubt did not cancel destiny. It refined it. Because while they were whispering, I was strengthening your root system. I allowed you to wrestle internally so that when public confirmation comes, you will stand unshaken. God says, chosen one, I am about to validate you in front of the same eyes that question you. There is a shift forming where your assignment will become undeniable. The same rooms that subtly resisted you will begin to recognize your value. The same voices that minimized you will reference you, not because you demanded it, but because fruit cannot be hidden forever. Understand this. Exposure is not always about scandal. Sometimes exposure is about revelation. I am revealing who I truly sent. Stay humble. Stay aligned. Do not rush to defend yourself prematurely. I defend what I design. And here is the tension rising now, because the fourth whisper was more personal. It wasn't about your strength. It wasn't about your reach. It wasn't even about your calling. It was about your past. And when that one surfaces publicly, it will not disqualify you like they hoped. It will disarm them completely. There are things you survived that you never advertised. Chapters you close without press conferences. Scars you carry that no one fully understands. And somehow, they found pieces of it. Not the whole story, just fragments. Enough to construct a narrative. Enough to whisper with confidence. God says, chosen one, when they couldn't question your strength, when they couldn't limit your reach, when they couldn't discredit your calling, they turned to your history. Here is the fourth thing they whispered in private. Number 4, if people knew their past, they wouldn't respect them. They leaned into your old seasons, your mistakes, your struggles, the moments when you were still learning who you were. They gathered pieces of your former self like evidence in a courtroom, hoping exposure would equal elimination. You felt it, the subtle probing questions, the resurfaced conversations, the way certain names from your past were suddenly mentioned again. It wasn't random curiosity, It was investigation. God says, they searched your history for ammunition, not realizing I already transformed the evidence. What they see as a liability, I call testimony. What they label failure, I call foundation. What they whisper as scandal, I frame as survival. They don't understand that your past is not proof of hypocrisy, it is proof of redemption. You were not always as disciplined as you are now, not always as discerning, not always as spiritually mature, but growth is not fraud. Transformation is not deception. It is evolution under grace. God says, I specialize in rewriting narratives. They assume that if the right details surface publicly, your credibility would collapse. They believe people only honor perfection, but they underestimated the power of authenticity. They underestimated how many lives will relate to your journey. Because here is the reversal. When your past becomes public in the way I allow it, it will not shame you. It will humanize you. It will deepen your authority. It will validate your growth. The very thing they hoped would embarrass you will establish you as real. God says, I do not call the flawless, I call the willing. And here is what unsettles them now. You are no longer hiding from who you were. You've made peace with your evolution. Shame does not control you anymore. Regret does not paralyze you anymore. You have integrated your past instead of denying it. That makes you dangerous, because a person who is no longer ashamed cannot be manipulated. They whispered, let's remind people who they used to be, but they forgot that who you used to be built who you are becoming. You see, exposure only destroys those who are pretending, but you've already confessed your imperfections in private prayer. You've already faced your flaws in quiet surrender. You've already allowed me to correct you. God says, what is surrendered cannot be weaponized. There is a public moment coming where part of your testimony will surface, not in chaos, not in scandal, but in strategy. It will be timed. It will be framed. It will reveal growth, not guilt. And when it does, people will not withdraw from you. They will lean closer, because they will see resilience. They will see grace in action. They will see what transformation actually looks like. Do not panic if certain old conversations start circulating. Do not overreact if someone hints at your history. Remain calm. Remain anchored. I am in control of the narrative. God says, I will use your past as proof that I was always with you. And while they are still calculating whether to release certain information, they don't realize I already factored it into your elevation plan. But there is one final whisper, the most desperate one, the one they only spoke among their tightest circle. It wasn't about breaking you. It wasn't about limiting you. It wasn't about discrediting you. It wasn't even about exposing you. It was about replacing you. And when that final whisper becomes public, it will reveal who was truly insecure all along. There is always a final strategy when insecurity realizes it cannot win directly, when strength fails, when limitation fails, when discrediting fails, when exposure fails. There is one last whisper spoken only among the closest circle, the desperate one. God says, chosen one, when they understood they could not break you, could not cap you, could not cancel you, they decided to compete with what I anointed. Here is the fifth thing they whispered in private. Number 5. If we can't stop them, we'll replace them. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was calculated. They believed influence could be duplicated. They assumed favor could be replicated. They thought calling was transferable by imitation. So they began positioning alternatives, subtle comparisons, strategic promotions, quiet substitutions. They tried to elevate someone similar, someone safer, someone easier to manage, someone who wouldn't disrupt the structure. But here is what they never understood. God says, anointing is not transferable through strategy. It is assigned through sovereignty. They can mimic your language. They can copy your tone. They can reproduce your format. They can even attempt to mirror your discipline, but they cannot duplicate your oil. Because what rests on you was not downloaded from trends, it was deposited in eternity. They whispered, "People won't notice the difference," but heaven said, "They will feel it." You see, authenticity carries weight. Presence carries atmosphere. When you enter spaces, something shifts. Not because you demand attention, but because alignment radiates. That cannot be staged. God says, "I do not create originals to be replaced by replicas." And here is the irony. Their attempt to replace you exposed how necessary you actually are. You don't attempt to substitute something irrelevant. You only replace what carries value. The very act of competition revealed your significance. But listen carefully. This is where maturity matters. Do not react. Do not compare. Do not compete back. When lions understand their identity, they do not argue with echoes. God says, "Your seat was not voted on, it was reserved." There is a public moment approaching where distinction will become obvious. Not through confrontation, not through scandal, not through shouting, through contrast. The substitute will lack depth, the imitation will lack endurance, the replica will lack fruit, and over time people will quietly gravitate back toward what is real. Because what I build sustains, what humans manufacture strains. You may notice certain circles drifting, certain dynamics shifting, certain opportunities redirecting. Do not panic. Transition is not replacement. It is separation for revelation. God says, "If I remove you from a room, it is because your next assignment requires a larger stage." They whispered, "We can phase them out." But they didn't realize destiny is not seasonal popularity. It is covenant alignment. Here is what is about to happen. The whispers will surface, not necessarily word for word, but through exposure of intention. Motives will become visible. Comparisons will collapse under scrutiny. Substitutions will lose momentum. And you will not need to say, "I told you so." Your consistency will speak. Your fruit will speak. Your peace will speak. Over 8 billion people, and I chose you intentionally. Not temporarily, not experimentally, intentionally. God says, "Chosen one, what they whispered in private is about to be public, not to vindicate your ego, but to validate your obedience." When the reveal happens, remain humble, remain grounded, remain grateful. Elevation without humility becomes downfall. But you have been trained too deeply for that. And if this message has been confirming what your spirit already sensed, don't just hear it, align with it. Stay connected, stay watchful, stay prepared. Because this is not just exposure season, it is distinction season. The whispers are fading, the revealing is rising. And when the public moment fully unfolds, they will realize they were never competing with you. They were competing with the one who sent you.